Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. The Spanish Civil War has been highlighted as an important prelude to World War II, with Germany, Italy and Russia providing men and material for the Republican and Nationalist forces. Augmenting this were other foreign fighters forming the international brigades. In this episode we'll explore this conflict to see how much of an influence it played on World War II. I'm joined by Alex Clifford, author of The People's Army in the Spanish Civil War and co-host of the podcast History's Most, a podcast that delves into interesting, underreported and controversial topics in history. I'll put a link to it on the website. Now, this podcast is free. If you don't already subscribe, head over to your podcast software of choice and hit the subscribe button to make sure you get your regular dose of World War II chat. This podcast is made possible by listeners like yourself who enjoy the show and help me find the time to put it together when they become patrons by committing to $1 or $2 each month via Patreon, or even pushing the boat out and committing to the Rockefeller level of support like listener Turner Yates. Thank you, Turner, for your support. And you can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. If Patreon's not your thing for whatever reason, and you would still like to join the gang, go to www2podcast.com/support and you'll find information on how to support the show via PayPal. In doing so, if you check the box to be added to the mailing list, I will send you links to extras as and when I have them. So that's www2podcast.com/support. Alex, thanks for joining me. Shall we start by outlining the background to the war? How did it break out?
In 1936, what you have in Spain is a general election in the February of 1936. And it's a really kind of polarized, bitter contest between left and right. You've got, on the one hand, all the kind of parties from, quite moderate liberals through to the communists form an alliance known as the Popular Front, like an electoral pact, if you like. And on the other hand, pretty much all the parties of the Spanish right form an organization called the National Bloc. I would describe it as it's almost like a win or die kind of atmosphere. And the reason for that is because Spain had been pretty unstable for the years preceding that election. You'd had a left-wing government of the kind of centre-left and left groups who'd been trying to reform the country. They had taken the Catholic Church, created a division between church and state for the first time in Spain. They had tried to massively reduce the size of the army and its influence on politics. Particularly offensive was their policies around land reform. They wanted to try and break up the bigger states, and you can imagine they basically succeeded in angering the church, the wealthy, and the army, which is a pretty bad trio to have against you. Then the right had been in power, and they had tried to basically undo those things that the left had been doing. There had been an uprising by socialists in 1934 as a kind of rejection of that, a general strike, which had been crushed by the army. So you already had quite a lot of instability and political division in Spain. And you can kind of understand why. If you're thinking about the mid-30s, people on the right would be looking at socialists and communists in Spain, although it must be said the Communist Party before the war was a very small organization, and having images in their head of the Russian Revolution. On the other hand, the political left, didn't have to look very far to Italy, Austria, Germany, and think what the right's doing of really clamping down, shutting down our organizations is this, the first steps of authoritarianism, even fascism in Spain. Again, the actual fascist party in Spain was quite small, but both sides, I think, were afraid of the other and saw each other as an existential threat. Now, in that general election in February 1936, the left, the Popular Front, won. And so the right naturally sees the left as an existential threat, so thinks, right, we are not going to just accept and wait for the next general election to come along. Basically, the campaigning funds that have been used to run the right selection campaign are channeled to a cabal of generals who begin to plot a coup attempt against the government. And over the spring and early summer of 1936, you get an increasingly unstable situation where you have a very weak government in Madrid that isn't really clamping down on these generals, that isn't really stopping violence by either the political left or right. And you have people on the right, fascist party, the Falange, deliberately trying to provoke disorder by murdering left-wing politicians, things like that. That's something the Nazis did. They deliberately created disorder in Weimar Germany, violence on the streets, because they knew it would make people think, oh, the system's breaking down, we need a stronger system. And the army eventually kind of puts together, well, generals within the army, it must be said it wasn't everybody in the army, but a circle of generals in the army put together a plan and stage a military coup in July 1936.
Now, the coups, it's not really, it's a failure insofar as it fails to win the country, doesn't it? So the country becomes divided. You've got the outside influence of Morocco as a Spanish colony with, is it the elite part of the Spanish army under Franco?
Absolutely right, yeah. So the reason there is a civil war in Spain is because this coup the army staged in July 1936 doesn't succeed. They don't take over the country in a few hours or days, as was their intention. So you get a split between parts of the country that support the government, the elected government, and parts of the country that support the military coup. The decisive, or perhaps most important part of the military's plan is the fact, as you say, the best part of the Spanish army, which was quite a, poor, by European standards, quite a backwards army. The best part of it was stationed in Morocco. It was called the Army of Africa. And that army contained veterans of a long-running war in Morocco known as the Rif War. It contained troops known as the Regulares, which were Moroccan mercenaries, which were particularly feared. It contained something called the Spanish Foreign Legion, which was actually 90% Spanish, but it was an attempt to emulate the French Foreign Legion, which also considered itself very much an elite within the Spanish army. So you had about 30,000 troops in Morocco who were head and shoulders above any other fighting force in Spain. Outside of that, you had in mainland Spain itself, the Spanish army kind of splits, and some garrisons support the uprising. Some garrisons support the uprising and are defeated, either by police or security forces or by workers' militias. And then some garrisons and officers actually even support the Republic. About 2,000 professional officers support the elected Republican government. So you get this situation where after a few days, it becomes clear that the situation is very unclear, because you have probably just over the majority of the country in the government's hands, Republican hands, certain cities and regions in the hands of the military rebels, and the best troops, which Francisco Franco had been associated with. He flies over with a private plane chartered from Croydon to fly from his base. He'd been posted out to the Canary Islands as a way the government thought of neutralizing him. Let's put him as far away from possible. Didn't really work, just meant they couldn't keep an eye on him. And he flew over to Morocco to take charge of this elite army. But the trouble is that they're kind of stuck in Morocco and the country is divided. So very early on, it looks like this coup has just failed and, it could all just fizzle out.
It's the Germans that move a large bulk of the army from Morocco to Spain. Does Franco approach the Germans, or does Hitler, see sort of Franco as a fascist and approach him to offer help?
Well, the official kind of leadership of the military rebels, there was a junta, and they had sent out diplomatic emissaries to both Italy and to Hitler's Germany. but through the official diplomatic channels, so through the foreign ministries of both countries, and they got pretty short shrift. What Franco did is he happened to meet, or it was brought to him, I believe, a representative of the Nazi Party in Morocco, a German living in Morocco who happened to be a Nazi Party member, head of an organization which was like the Nazi Party abroad, and basically sent him off with some of Franco's own men to talk to Hitler and see if Hitler would help out. And they arrive in Germany and find that Hitler's actually in Bayreuth in southern Germany attending the yearly Wagner festival. He's just come out of a concert. Obviously, famously, Hitler, a lover of Wagner's operas. He's just come out of the opera and he meets this delegation and just on the cuff says, yeah, sure, we'll help you out. Yeah, let's go for it. And obviously the delegation very much emphasized, the anti-communist credentials, the fact that these were good, strong nationalists. And Hitler very much kind of, I think in that meeting, in that spur of the moment, just on an ideological level, felt affinity with the cause of the Spanish military rebels and decided just to go for it. Interestingly, over time, that kind of ideological commitment very much switches to a much more pragmatic, strategic and economic one of, right, we're now helping the Spanish nationalists, the Spanish rebels. What can we get out of this? And they end up basically getting payment in kind through raw materials they need for German rearmament in exchange for Nazi military support.
Now, if we turn the tables and look at the Republicans, if the bulk of the army, and you've got the elite army over on the nationalist side, what's left for the Republicans? Because they clearly have. Well, it's relatively a long, protracted civil war with some, large set-piece battles. So what's left for the Republicans? They clearly put something together that's formidable enough to keep them going.
Yeah, so on the one hand, you've got, as you say, the majority of the Spanish army, and particularly the officer corps, is with the nationalist rebels. As I said, within literally a few days of the war starting, they begin to get support from Italy and from Nazi Germany. On the other hand, the Republicans have got a real problem, because how do you fight a war when your own army has rebelled against you? What do you actually use to do the fighting? At first, in literally the first few febrile days of the war, when they're trying to put down this military coup, in the cities and regions where it is put down, it's put down by a combination of things, primarily the armed kind of security forces and police. Some of them stay loyal. There is workers' militias set up by trade unions, set up by political parties in the first days of the war, and they are swiftly armed by the government from whatever arsenals they retain the control over. And you have a portion of the army, I mentioned before, around 2,000 professional officers stay loyal, bringing with them some units, although it must be said the Republican government basically sent home the conscripts that had been part of the army, because they basically wanted in the first few days to take the sting out of the rebellion. So at first, it's a real hodgepodge. They don't have enough equipment, particularly heavy equipment, artillery, machine guns, that sort of thing. They don't have a large trained force. And as a result, for the first, 3 to 6 months of the war, it's one-way traffic. They don't really stand a chance fighting against the Spanish army proper, if you like. And Franco's Army of Africa, we were talking about, gets transported across by Nazi and Italian aircraft, as we said, across from Morocco to Spain. And they cut through southern Spain through to Madrid in a matter of months, in a real kind of lightning campaign. And every time a workers' militia tries to stop them, you can imagine the results of trained professionals against people who were sometimes literally going out there with, shotguns. There's one peasant that I quote a few times in my book that says that when the war broke out, they basically broke into the local landowner's house because he was known to have a collection of antique weapons. And so the peasants' militia in this particular village had medieval and Renaissance antique, swords and bits of, they were just strapping on bits of armor, that sort of thing. So in the warfare of 1936, they didn't do especially well.
They become backed by the Russians. Now, by this point, Stalin sort of turned his back on the idea of international communism. Why is Stalin getting the Russia involved? As you said, the Communist Party is relatively small, so presumably their links were minor.
Yeah, it's one of the kind of, I think, aspects of the Spanish Civil War that's not that well understood, at least in popular history, of what are the Russians doing here? What are the Soviet Union's interest in Spain? And you're right, there wasn't much contact before the Civil War started. There wasn't even, I believe, in print, a Russian to Spanish dictionary in 1936. So there wasn't really any, in fact, I don't think there was even formal diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and Spain. So what happens is, initially the Republic appeals for help to France, which is a neighboring country, and it also has a Popular Front government as well. And France is pretty keen, actually, on doing so. And then the British Foreign Office says, look, if you support the Spanish Republic in the Civil War and it turns into a world war, if it escalates, we won't support you. We'll stand aloof in the next European war. So France very quickly, alongside Britain, decides, no, we're not getting involved. And they actually, in August 1936, put together a non-intervention agreement signed by all the major powers of Europe, including Hitler and Mussolini, despite the fact they were already intervening, to say we're not going to get involved. And we're going to ban all sales and exports of any military material whatsoever to Spain to try and limit the conflict. And the Soviet Union signed up to it too. Now, what happens is it becomes clear that by September 1936 is that Hitler and Mussolini are not obeying the non-intervention agreement. Shock horror, fascist dictators are not abiding by international law. And the Soviet delegation, this non-intervention agreement has a committee set up in London that meets on a regular basis to just check that no one's intervening in the war in Spain. And the Soviet delegation presents evidence of Italian and German intervention. And as it's, the 1930s appeasement, Britain and France near enough basically shrug their shoulders and don't really do anything about it. So the Soviets had, as you say, moved away from a policy of exporting revolution around the world, which at various times in the Soviet Union's history, that's what they were trying to do. But in the 1930s, Stalin, he realized that the biggest threat to the Soviet Union was Nazi Germany. And Germany had actually been home to the biggest communist movement outside of Russia before Hitler had taken power, and that had all been crushed and dismantled. So in the mid-30s, the Soviet foreign policy had changed from world revolution, let's overthrow every government in the world until we have a kind of communist utopia, to what they called socialism in one country, which is, we've got a brilliant socialist project going on here in Russia. The main priority of world communism is to defend that project. The method they chose to do that was advising communist parties around the world, you have got to form alliances with other left-wing and other liberal parties in order to stop the rise of fascism. But Stalin also did that on the international stage. He was looking to Britain and France and hoping to sign an alliance with them to either prevent Hitler going to war or to ensure that he had some allies. And he'd, in 1935, done a collective security agreement with the French. Now, when it got to Spain, as I've said, the non-intervention clearly wasn't working, and Franco was advancing very quickly, and it looked like could win the war in a matter of months. So Stalin and Soviet policymakers were looking at the map of Europe. And interestingly, the Rome-Berlin Axis, which became the Axis of World War II, was signed in September 1936 because Hitler and Mussolini were cooperating in Spain. That was the origin of it. So clearly Spain was bringing Italy and Germany together. And so Stalin saw this fascist anti-communist alliance being formed, wanted his own alliance with Britain and France. At the moment, they weren't budging on Spain, and he was looking at the great map of Europe, the kind of strategic view, and he looked at France, which was his only ally. Soviet Union was a pariah state. He's got a security agreement with them, but he's looking at the map and he's seeing, well, they've got Germany to their east, which is their traditional enemy. Italy is now allying itself with Germany. That's to their southeast. And what if Franco wins in Spain? He's going to be an ally of Mussolini and Hitler. So you have a security situation for France where they might face a war on three fronts. And there's a fascinating dispatch sent by the British ambassador to Moscow back to London, basically informing the British government on Stalin's thinking in August 1936. And he said, look, for the Russians, Spain is all about France. They are really worried about what is going to happen to France if Franco wins this civil war. He actually uses the phrase in that dispatch, revolution can wait as far as the Soviets are concerned. So I think there's this perception, and it's an understandable perception considering what happens after World War II, where the Soviet Union very much is setting up puppet states in the countries it occupies. There's a perception, I think, that, the Soviets are intervening in a war in 1936. They're obviously trying to set up a puppet state. Well, that would have really hurt Stalin because it would have really been a turnoff for Britain and France if there was a communist puppet state in Western Europe. And Stalin's whole goal was to make friends with Britain and France. So at least the decision to intervene that Stalin came to in September 36, it was all about trying to prevent fascist victory and ensure, he hoped to secure an alliance with Britain and France by doing that.
Well, I wonder if that's why, if you look at Germany and Italy, they obviously both put boots on the ground. They, in theory, send volunteers. In practice, I think the volunteers are told to go, aren't they? But Russia is not quite so overt sending military people and these advisors, but it does send a lot of pretty decent tanks and planes over in quite large quantities.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I would say each of those three great powers that get involved intervene in their own unique way. Italy, it's very much quantity over quality. They about 80,000 troops over the course of the war. The majority of Franco's air force was Italian in terms of both manpower and aircraft. But the quality, listeners familiar with the Second World War, Italians and going with quality or indeed fighting prowess at that time just wasn't the case. So they send, little tankettes, which are next to useless. The main aircraft is a decent aircraft for the mid-30s, the CR-32 fighter and the bombers like the SM-80. They're all right for the 30s. The other hand, the Nazis, it's quality over quantity. There's a lot smaller scale intervention, probably a maximum of about 20,000 German military personnel serve in Spain. But you get the Messerschmitt 109, the Ju-87, the Heinkel 111, things that World War II fans will probably be familiar with, all get their first use in Spain and are head and shoulders above what else is operating there. Must be said, though, on the armoured front, it's only the Panzer I that gets used in Spain, and that isn't a particularly impressive tank. The Soviets, you're right, try their best to avoid sending too many people. There's only ever about 800 Soviet advisors of all kinds in Spain at any one time, and they'll be political advisors, military advisors, tank crews, technical experts, some pilots. In total, probably about 2,000 Soviet personnel serve in Spain. What I would say about what the Soviets provide is it's a huge mixed bag. So the headlines, things like the I-16 fighter was a very good monoplane fighter for the mid-30s. The T-26 tank and the BT-5 tank are both, for the Spanish Civil War, excellent, the best tanks in the war. On the other hand, the amounts of the great quality stuff like that is fairly low. So it's only about 280 T-26s supplied over the whole war. To put that in some context, in a World War I battle like, say, Amiens in 1918, you had the British deploying about 500 tanks. So over the course of the whole war, the Republicans have 280. They're never able to stage even a World War I style armored offensive, never mind a kind of, blitzkrieg type operation. The other problem is that the Soviets, I would say, are less than benevolent allies in the sense that they also take this opportunity to just dispose of any and all equipment that they have in their stores that they don't want anymore. So you get stuff from the 1870s, you get stuff from the 1890s, you get stuff from the Russo-Japanese War. I mean, you get Arisakas being sent to Spain, that the Arisaka rifles that the Russians had obviously captured while fighting the Japanese 30 years beforehand. You obviously get a huge amount of World War I kit that was never used or is badly used, either stuff that's been in storage for decades, stuff that is not got any spare parts, stuff that doesn't have the right ammunition for it. What's interesting about in the First World War, because Russia was so weak and Britain, France, etc., were desperately trying to string the Russians along, they sent the Russians all sorts of equipment. So the equipment that then the Russians 20 years later were sending to the Republicans is so varied. You've got British rifles, you've got French rifles, you've got American-made rifles. Like I said, Japanese ones. It's just a logistical nightmare. The shipments that the Spanish Republicans must have been opening thinking, what is this? And what ammunition goes with this? And where are the instructions? And is there any spare parts or cleaning kits? And the answer to most of those questions is no. They end up, I've read first-hand stuff saying they cleaned their rifles with olive oil, which didn't work very well, apparently. So, yes, the Russians did send some really excellent stuff. Even in small arms, there were small numbers of weapons that would go on to be used in World War II that were decent quality. It must be said that was actually probably the minority overall, because they basically just emptied their stores on the Spanish Republicans, who were obviously desperate for anything in the situation we've described. And, by the way, did it all at quite exorbitant prices as well.
It did occur to me when I was thinking about this that once you start backing one side or the other, and you're obviously hoping for some financial return selling all this stuff, at what point do you stop backing the other side because you're just throwing good money after bad, which must be a consideration. And I guess the Russians eventually come to that conclusion, and no one wants to be necessarily associated with the losing side. So we've got two organised opposing sides. These aren't the guerrilla style fighters that I had in mind when I read For Whom the Bell Tolls. We do have large set piece actions, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. There is, again, popular perception of the Spanish Civil War, I think, because the novels of it, For Whom the Bell Tolls and Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, and I think even, a film like Pan's Labyrinth from a few years back, it all kind of portray quite a guerrilla warfare or very irregular warfare, kind of militia-based, bands of kind of militias doing this work. That is really quite far from the truth. You had these militias in the first few months of the war that I described. They were, for one thing, they were actually fighting a conventional war. They were trying to defend their territory against the Francoists who were attacking, so they weren't hiding in forests or hills or mountains or anything like that. And secondly, once the Republic actually managed to get its act together in the winter of 1936-7, they form a regular army, which, to all intents and purposes, is a standard kind of European army organized on Spanish and Soviet lines, that means that the fighting of the Spanish Civil War, for the vast majority of it, is not a guerrilla campaign. It's not even a militia-type war. It's a regular war of attrition with set-piece battles between two standardized militaries, admittedly of highly varying quality, but two standardized, regular armies nonetheless. Because of the Soviet equipment that's supplied, and also because of huge efforts on the part of the Republican government and the officers that they do have, they turn the militias into a regular army, which is called the Ejército Popular, the best translated as the People's Army, which is going to fight the army of the Franquists.
The Battle of Brunete you describe as a Spanish version of the British Somme offensive, which I thought was an interesting comparison because you're harking back to the First World War. How relevant is the First World War combat to the Spanish Civil War when we're comparing it? It's obviously sitting between two wars.
It is, yeah. And I think because it's taken place 1936 through to 1939, it's very much seen as part of or a prelude to the Second World War. And I think, there is some comparisons to be made. But in terms of the First World War, a lot of the military equipment that was used was First World War vintage, as I've kind of set out. The big kind of battles were very much kind of grinding attritional affairs. Again, in many ways, bearing some resemblance to First World War battles. They're basically massive slogging matches of two sides throwing themselves at each other. Neither side has enough tanks to make it a mobile war, or at least to, carry out any sort of something that we would see as like, blitzkrieg in some way. But also, I think one of the most relevant reasons that it's comparable to the First World War is that the headache facing commanders in the Spanish Civil War was very similar to that of First World War commanders. Admittedly, the trench system and the defenses were nowhere near as sophisticated as the First World War. And that's understandable considering, A, the military backwardness of the two sides, but B, the fact the battlefront runs the length of Spain from the Pyrenees through to the Mediterranean south coast. So it's 2 or 3 times as long as the Western Front. So you're never going to get this kind of fortifications you do in the Western Front in World War One. But the reason the headache is similar is that the Republicans in particular, and to some extent the Nationalists too at different times, find it really difficult to turn a break-in into a breakthrough, if you see what I mean. You can punch through the enemy's lines, but they find it really hard to exploit that. And just like in the First World War, where if you concentrate enough men and artillery, you can break through the lines of trenches, but you can't turn this into a major victory. You can't advance for miles. And the limitations are very much similar of that you can only advance as far as, as men can get in a day. And enemy will very quickly start rushing in reinforcements. You'll have to break through again and again, and it just becomes this attritional slogging match. And you find, reading first-hand accounts of the soldiers on the ground so many times, particularly from the Republican side that I've studied in depth, the great challenge is there's an enemy position, machine guns, barbed wire, and how do you get through?
In theory, that should be tanks and aircraft. But slightly confusingly, you're drawing comparisons with the First World War. It's Anthony Beauvoir, isn't it? Beauvoir draws parallels with the Second World War when he talks about his Stalingrad in miniature.
Yeah, I think...
which sort of muddies the waters of where it sits.
It does. And I think the truth is that it sits somewhere between the two. For all the reasons I've just set out, yeah, there's a lot of similarities with the First World War. But equally, I can definitely see there is obviously comparisons with the Second World War. I've already listed some of the kind of weapons and equipment used that would go on to see a lot of action in World War II. And of course, you do get tanks and aircraft used, and particularly air power, I think, was really significant for the Franquists with their Italian and Nazi support. They were able to take control of the skies and use air power in a way that I think is one of the aspects that is fairly similar to World War II is close air support, and they're able to use it quite effectively, which is probably why their offensives are more successful than the Republicans. I would also probably point to the fact that the alliances of the two sides actually mirror in some ways the Second World War, in the sense that you've got, a reactionary militarist fascist kind of alliance of Franco, Hitler, Mussolini on the one hand, and against them you have the Republicans, which is made up of everyone from kind of people in favor of democracy and liberalism through to Stalin and communism. So you've got a broad alliance of the kind of moderate through to the far left. And you could say that mirrors the alliance of World War II in that you've kind of got democracies and the Soviet Union fighting against militarist and fascist states in Japan, Italy, and Germany. And Anthony Beevor, when he's talking about Stalingrad in miniature, is talking about the Battle of Teruel in the winter of 37-38, which in many ways is a kind of Stalingrad-esque battle, because it's a horrible urban battle in the middle of winter where one side attacks, besieges the city, it's the Republicans, and they eventually capture it. But then a huge flanking counteroffensive is launched that cuts off that city and ends up being that the besiegers become the besieged, and the Franquists manage to launch this great counterattack and undo all the Republican gains. So there is definitely comparisons to be made to both. And as Stanley Payne, a great historian of the Civil War, has said, it sits between the two. It's not quite the opening chapter of World War II, but it's also, it has evolved somewhat from World War One.
Yeah, well, there's certain, it's straight from a military point of view, there's certain things missing, isn't there? So there's no blitzkrieg. The easy boxes to tick are the things that are there, not necessarily how they're used. Yeah,
you're right. You can tick off Messerschmitt Bf 109, Junkers Ju 87 Stuka, and be like, oh yeah. Mm-hmm. But you're right. It's that doesn't really take into account what war was being fought here and how it was being fought.
Which sort of brings it back to being that sort of idealistic war, which I guess is also hammered home by the sort of influx of the international brigades. You pointed out that it's Hemingway and Orwell. These people are writing about their experiences, which are possibly, from the international brigades' point of view, very different from perhaps how the majority of those embroiled in the war saw it.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that, people associate with the international brigades these volunteers from around the world. There was about 32,000 in total from around 50 different nations who came to fight with the Spanish Republicans. Interestingly, probably only about 130,000 Spaniards volunteered for the Republican Army and 100,000 for the Francoist army. And yet you have 32,000 foreigners volunteering, which proportionally is huge when you think about it. Both sides overwhelmingly were conscript armies, which helps explain some of the lackluster performances in battle. But to go back to the international brigades, they're one of the really fascinating aspects, and definitely one that gets a lot of attention with the history. And part of it, I think, is because of Hemingway and Orwell, although it must be said that neither of them were actually ever members of the International Brigade. Orwell went off to fight for a militia that was part of a small party called the POUM, the POUM, which was a kind of, the best way to put it would be an anti-Stalinist Marxist party. Often it's labeled Trotskyist, but they'd actually formally fallen out with Trotsky, that particular political party. So technically not Trotskyist, but in inverted commas, Trotskyist. And Hemingway, although he liked to talk about how close he got to the battles, was only ever there as a reporter. He never bore arms, so to speak, in the Spanish Civil War. So the international brigades became shock troops of the Republican Army in that they were deployed again and again and again in the kind of toughest spots, whether it be spearheading the offensives, whether it being plugging a gap in the line when they were desperately hanging on to a position. They were overwhelmingly made up of, they were about 80% working class, which is, again, I think contrary to the popular image of them all being poets. And it depends on country to country, but certainly a majority were Communist Party members. The brigades were recruited in each nation by the local Communist Party. So if you were in Britain wanting to join the International Brigades, you had to go to London, to King Street, where the Communist Party headquarters were, be interviewed, and then you were given a weekend ticket to Paris. You didn't need a passport back then. You could kind of do the equivalent of the Eurostar and get a train to the south coast, a ferry, and then a train to Paris. And then the French Communist Party in Paris basically was the staging post, and they gathered together volunteers from all nations and would then give them tickets down to the Pyrenees, and you would then be snuck across the frontier by guides. And they went on to, like I say, fight in pretty much every major battle in some of the toughest spots and suffer absolutely murderous casualty rates. I've seen one historian put it at 93% casualty rate. That includes minor wounds and things like that, but, killed, wounded, missing, captured of 93%. So understandably, over time, their quality and their combat effectiveness, and particularly historians pick up on their motivation, their commitment to the cause and discipline fades because, they get chewed up basically, and the reservoir of volunteers dries up as well as the time goes on, because the war does drag on for pretty much 3 years. So there's an initial glut of volunteers, but less and less people start going, and the International Brigades eventually, what they have to do is Spanish conscripts have to get integrated into the units, and the internationals are increasingly just the officers, the NCOs, and they become majority Spanish eventually. So there's a lot of, I think, myths and misconceptions out there about the International Brigades, and they were definitely, for the most part, very ideologically committed, and they were used like shock troops. They were thrown into the front lines again and again. And it's a kind of story of diminishing returns and real kind of, I would say, hardship on the part of those volunteers compared to the average Spanish conscript who might spend the war on a quiet part of this, as I say, massive 1,000-kilometre long front doing not very much.
Which struck me about the International Brigade is presumably, they're not just politically motivated, but presumably they're a cadre of men who potentially all fought in the First World War. The Spanish won't have fought in the First World War, so they've not got that necessarily 4 or 5 years of combat, whereas those allies who volunteered potentially will have fought and will at least know which way around a rifle goes and things.
Yeah, you had, like you say, the Spanish army was desperately short on proper modern combat experience. The officers who did stay loyal to the Republic and serve in the People's Army, many of them had either never seen combat before or had seen small amounts. The top Republican general, Jose Meade, he'd only commanded a regiment in combat before many years ago. And then in the Spanish Civil War, he was, commanding first an army, then an army group, and then supreme commander. On the other hand, the internationals, you're right, there was significant numbers of them who'd served in the Great War, because you're talking about people coming from Britain, from France, from Germany, from Italy, and a lot of, ordinary men had spent time in the forces. And a lot of those countries as well had conscription even after the war of some kind. So you did have a cadre of men with generally more military experience than your average Spanish Republican brigade. For example, most of the people picked to be officers in the International Brigade, it seems to have been pretty much a requirement that you had served in the war, in the First World War. Or else, as time went on and they could be less and less picky because of these casualties, that you'd served in the military in some capacity. So you had, for example, one of the best British battalion commanders, a guy called Sam Wilde. He was too young to have fought in the First World War, but he had been in the Royal Navy. He'd done tours in the Royal Navy. So, yeah, like you say, there was, and again, the Spanish Civil War often is termed a poor man's war. We're not talking about elites here. These are not, stormtroopers. These are not commandos by any stretch of the imagination. These are just people who happen to know the basics of military life and have a modicum of military training as compared to the rest of the army, which has very little of that.
Yeah. That with the factionalization of the Republicans, it's amazing they managed to go on along as long as they did. And it starts really, and I think ends with a coup as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's another funny thing about the Spanish Civil War. Like we said, it starts with a military coup that fails, and it ends with a military coup. You have in 1939, it's very clear, early 1939, that the Republic is going to lose. And the Francoists storm Catalonia, which was really one of the left-wing heartlands of Spain, in December and January of 39. The government had been sitting, the Republican government had been sitting in Barcelona. They'd obviously fled across the border to France. Most of them had then, got a plane or a ship back to the part of Spain that was still Republican control, which was a kind of rump of about 30% of Spain, covering the kind of center and southeast. You had Valencia, Madrid, Murcia, and the Prime Minister, Juan Negrin, basically says, to the president and to the top generals, right, come back from France now, let's keep fighting. Because he knew there was no real option for the Republicans. He had made secret advances, secret kind of contacts with Franco, seeking a negotiated settlement. And of course, there was nothing doing. Franco was not willing. And why would he be when he was clearly on the brink of victory? Negrin hoped that basically they could hold on long enough and that continued resistance would be their last kind of negotiating chip, if you like. And that, he had vague hopes that a wider European war was going to break out soon, which of course was in the air at that time. And that obviously then Britain and France would be at war with Germany. And so hopefully they would take up the cause of the Spanish Republicans against Franco. And of course, in that prediction, that was to come true in a few short months' time. But what happened was you had a combination of army officers and dissident politicians who basically thought there's no point in fighting anymore. There's no point in us continuing to fight the Francoists. And they staged in March 1939 a coup to oust Negrin and also to oust the Spanish Communist Party from its positions of influence in the government and the army, in the hope that that would bring Franco round to want to negotiate a peace, because it's like, oh yeah, we're anti-communist as well. And of course it doesn't work. They do stage this coup. It's led by a guy called Colonel Casado. They oust the prime minister. They oust the Spanish Communist Party. But after a short civil war within a civil war between pro-communist and anti-communist Republicans, the Francoists then launch a final offensive. And of course, with the Republicans in this state, there is virtually no resistance, and they kind of crumble in a matter of weeks. And the war officially ends on the 1st of April, 1939.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, thank you, Alex. Loyal listener, if you want to read more about the Spanish Civil War, the book is The People's Army in the Spanish Civil War by Alex Clifford. Well, that's it for this time out. Next time, I think we'll be looking at the Luftwaffe and the Battle of Britain. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.